All right, let's get into some dynasty running back rankings. So I know there's going to be a lot of disagreement. So if you disagree with something, just let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. So there's a couple of things that I think about when I rank running backs. One thing is team commitment. Another thing is the actual talent of the running back. Uh, Another thing is how long they have left probably in the league, whether they're still on their first contract or second contract, how likely they are to have a second contract, their immediate situation, their long-term situation. And yeah, there's even more than that that goes into ranking these running backs. And so I'm going to do my best to break down each one of these things with each of these running backs and then kind of explain as to why I have each running back in their specific place in these rankings. And so we begin with Bijan Robinson. So on the year, he's the running back 5. He's 5'11", 215 pounds, so that gives him a 30.0 BMI. One thing I did forget to mention is I prefer running backs with a 30.0 or greater BMI because that's historically the threshold necessary to be a featured back. Now, we've seen running backs like Christian McCaffrey that were 28.2 for their BMI that are used as featured backs. And so it's not an end-all be-all, but it is preferable. And so he was selected in the first round this past season, 8th overall by the Falcons. And so that is a heavy team commitment. And so that means that he, in general, is likely to have his 5th-year option renewed, then potentially franchise tagged if he doesn't reach a contract agreement sooner than that down the line here. And so he's also only 22.8 years old, so really, really young. And historically, the last age of peak running back production is 28, so he has a ton of time until then. And so when we think about his competition, Tyler Algier is his competition. I believe Tyler Algier is a fine running back. He's more so a power back, and so he brings the power complement that Bijan doesn't necessarily bring quite as much of. And so taking a look at his finish this past season, he was the running back 9, which when you think about the context of they had 2 horrible quarterbacks that played throughout most of the season, they had Arthur Smith. His usage was horrible, and yet he was still the running back 9 on the season. Now, we also see that he's utilized heavily in the passing game, and so that's another thing that I forgot to mention that I really value among running backs is their pass catching ability because it raises your floor and your ceiling. When you think about how good he is a very good running back. And so I took a look at stats from running backs from weeks 1 through 12, and I only looked at running backs who had at least 50 rush attempts or more. And so Bijan Robinson's 167 rush attempts ranked 12th in the NFL. His 783 rushing yards ranked 10th. His PFF rushing grade of 90.9 is 3rd. His yards after contact per attempt of 3.05 is 22nd. His missed tackles forced of 38 is tied for 7th. His explosive rushes, which means 10 or more yards, of 14 are tied for 21st. His breakaway run percentage, which is 15 or more yards, is 22.1%, which is 32nd. His PFF receiving grade of 90.2 is 2nd. His 49 targets are 4th. His 45 receptions are 4th. His 359 receiving yards are also 4th. His yards per route run of 1.16 is tied for 13th, and his total touchdowns of 7 is 13th. And so I think the PFF rushing and receiving grade are pretty accurate here and paint a better picture just to how good he is as a complete running back. I don't anticipate his situation depreciating anytime soon. They have Kirk Cousins for the now and Michael Penix for the future. They have Kyle Pitts and Drake London around him. And so it's going to make it really tough for defenses to just stack the box constantly and only worry about him. I think he's one of the most talented running backs in the NFL. He's definitely top 3 in my opinion. And because of his draft capital, his situation looking good for both the short term and the long term, and his ability to be a bell cow back if necessary, that I do think he is the best running back in the NFL for Dynasty right now and is my Dynasty running back 1. Now, when Ashton Genty comes in this next season, that is going to change. But for the immediate future right now, Bijan Robinson is number 1. My Dynasty running back 2 is Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. So he's 5'9", 199. That does give him a 29.4 BMI. Now, that is below the 30.0 threshold, but he's also not used as a bell cow, so both of those things are working against him. And it's going to be one of the reasons why I have him just a little bit lower than Bijan. But just like Bijan, this past season he was selected in the first round, 12th overall, so that is incredible draft capital, just like with Bijan. Now, he's only 22 years and 7 months old, And so he's just like Bijan, has a ton of time before the last age in which running backs typically have peak production seasons of 28. And just like Bijan, he should probably have his 5th-year option renewed, potentially be franchise tagged down the line too. And so once again, if he doesn't reach a contract agreement at some point in the line sooner. And so I think that Jahmyr Gibbs is an incredible talent with a really safe floor. He hasn't scored less than 10 fantasy points in any game yet this season. And even though he's in a committee with Dave Montgomery, who's a talented back, he still puts up regular running back 2 or better production. He has elite top shelf upside. And should Dave Montgomery go down, Jahmyr Gibbs has RB1 overall upside. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs is a little bit less talented, in my opinion, than Bijan, but still one of the premier talents at the running back position. And just like Bijan, he does get a ton of utilization in the passing game. We saw this past season that he had over 70 targets, 50 receptions, 300 yards, and a touchdown. His targets and receptions probably aren't going to match what he did this past season, but his yardage should, and he already has 1 receiving touchdown. And he's coming off a running back 10 finish in his rookie season, which when you contextualize that with him basically not being used for, I believe it was the first 5 or so weeks of his rookie season, that's incredible. And he did miss 2 games as well during his rookie season. This season, he's the running back 4 at this point in time. So yeah, he is the real deal. Taking a look at his stats, his 154 rush attempts rank 18th, his 886 rushing yards rank 4th, his 85.2 PFF rushing grade ranks 9th, his 3.22 yards after contact per attempt are tied for 14th, his 39 missed tackles forced are 6th, his explosive rushes, which are rushes of 10 or more yards, of 25 are 3rd, his breakaway run percentage is 43.6%, which is tied for 2nd in the entire NFL. His 71.2 PFF receiving grade is tied for 12th. His 32 targets are tied for 18th. His 26 receptions are tied for 21st. His 265 receiving yards are 11th. His yards per out run of 1.51 are 10th. And his 11 total touchdowns are 3rd. And so his situation with the Lions could potentially take a little bit of a hit. It's reasonably likely that Ben Johnson, their OC, is going to leave. I hope he goes to either the Jags or the Bears, but we'll see what happens there. There's also a chance that he stays. But should Ben Johnson leave, I do think that is going to lower the situation just a little bit. But there's so much talent. They have such a great offensive line, a good quarterback with Jared Goff, that I'm really not worried about Jahmyr Gibbs long term. But I do think that his situation isn't quite as safe as Bijan Robinson's. And with him being just a little bit less talented, in my opinion, and a little bit smaller and not being a featured back, even though he's in a fantastic spot and performing really well, I do have him just a tick behind Bijan, but still in the S tier of running backs. We begin the A tier, the second tier of running backs, with Breece Hall of the New York Jets. So he's 5'11", 217. That does give him a 30.3 BMI, which is above the 30.0 threshold to be a featured back. Throughout his career, he basically has been a featured back. They did bring in Braylon Allen this season, though, and so he has started to see a little bit of his usage dip, but he's still a plenty featured enough back so that it's really not hampering his production per se. Now, one difference between him and the previous 2 running backs is that he was selected in the 2nd round, so his team doesn't have that 5th-year option with him, and he is just a little bit older, being 23 and a half years old, basically, but still one of the premier running back talents in the NFL. When we think about his situation, it's reasonably decent right now, but I do expect it to regress heavily. So his quarterback is Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers is pretty old now by NFL standards. I do think that with them not having anybody in the fold, really, that it is going to hamper his long-term upside. I don't think the offense is going to be scoring as many touchdowns in the future. And so that, combined with the fact that he has just one more year on his rookie contract in 2025, that he is going to be a second contract running back. Maybe he leaves, maybe he stays, but with that uncertainty, combined with the lack of security in terms of his contract situation, I do think that just puts him a hair below the previous 2 running backs that I've mentioned. When I think about how Breece Hall's performed in his rookie season, he was tremendous, but he did get hurt in his 7th game, and so he finished as the RB42. It was an ACL tear. It was a clean ACL tear, so we do prefer, if it has to be an ACL, that it's not a multi-ligament injury. Well, he came back and was the RB2 in a full PPR. This season, he's the RB8, so he's establishing himself as a top 10 option consistently. Well, when we think about his production this season, it hasn't been quite as good as I thought it would have been. His 152 rush attempts are 19th, his 632 rushing yards are 18th, his PFF rushing grade of 63.1 is 45th, his yards after contact per attempt of 3.13 is 19th, his 23 missed tackles forced are tied for 23rd, his 10-plus rushes of 18 are tied for 14th, his breakaway run percentage of 28.2 is 20th, his PFF receiving grade of 54.1 is 43rd, but his utilization in the passing game is really booming him this season. His 59 targets rank second, his 46 receptions are third, his 401 receiving yards are second, his 1.46 yards per out run are tied for 13th, and his 6 total touchdowns are 18th. So not quite the season that I thought we were going to see out of him. He's had some really high highs, but his floor has been lowered tremendously, and I think that's especially because of Braylon Allen being there. And so with Braylon Allen not eating into his workload in the sense of replacing him or anything generally, that is lowering his ceiling and his floor. And that combined with him just not looking quite as good as he has in other seasons this year, I do think that puts him a little bit below. But because of his perfect utilization in the passing game, that gives him a really good floor in general with a really good ceiling. I still think he's one of the more talented backs in the NFL. And so because he doesn't have that first round draft capital, he is starting to cede a little bit of work to Braylon Allen and isn't getting quite the featured utilization, especially in the running game, that he had in previous seasons. I do consider him just a little bit below the other two running backs, but still one of the better assets at running back. And he should still have a tremendous career and should still be a regular top 10 contributor basically every season until he bottoms out eventually. Now we have Achane of the Miami Dolphins. So he is a little bit more like Jahmyr Gibbs in his build, but smaller than Jahmyr Gibbs. Just like Gibbs, he's 5'9", but instead of being 199, he's 188. Now, he's probably added a little bit of weight since this measurement, but still, like Gibbs, a little bit of a smaller back. That does give him, at least back then, a 27.8 BMI, which is well below the threshold of 30.0. But he's seen an increase in utilization this season. He isn't quite a featured back. They do sprinkle in Mostert and Jaylen Wright, so not a featured back, but he gets a lot of passing game utilization. When we think about his situation, it's a little bit tricky. So if Tua continues to play at quarterback for them, I love his situation long term. I don't expect them to add any running back competition, really. And so I do think that he is one of the more explosive running backs on a per-touch basis. When you look at his contract, he was selected in the 3rd round this past season. And so that does mean that including this year, he has 3 years remaining on his rookie contract. And he's still only 23 years and 1 month old. So still well below the maximum age of 28 in which you see peak running back production. I still love his situation. There is the looming concern of the potential for Tua to retire at any given point in time. And should that happen, that is going to lower their production. We saw that when Tua was out with a concussion this season, he was not even remotely close to the same player. And so that is something to worry about. But Tua, for what it's worth, has said that he has no plans of retiring at all. And so I'm going to take his word for it. But that is something to think about. So Achane this past season was ridiculous. He had 7.77 yards per carry on the season and 11 touchdowns in only 11 games. He did miss some time due to injury. The size comes in play there. This season, he's the running back 6. He has 8 touchdowns at this point in time, so a little bit below his pace this past season. His yards per carry is a lot lower as well, but he's also being utilized a lot more in terms of the total amount of carries in which he's receiving. When we think about his stats this season, his rush attempts of 132 are 24th, though he did miss some time. His rush yards of 562 are 26th. His PFF rushing grade of 80.3 is 12th. His yards after contact per attempt of 2.98 is tied for 24th. His 22 missed tackles forced are tied for 25th. His explosive rushes of 15 are tied for 16th. His breakaway run percentage of 24.9% is 28th, but his receiving grade and basically everything to do with receiving, just like with Breece Hall, is really booning him this season. So his PFF receiving grade of 82.2 is 4th, his 53 targets are 3rd, his 49 receptions are 2nd, his 373 receiving yards are 3rd, his yards per out run of 1.65 is 7th, and his 8 total touchdowns are 8th. And so what we do have here is a complete running back. He's explosive in the run game. He's a tremendous receiver and heavily featured in the receiving game. That gives him a really good floor with a very good ceiling because of how explosive he is. He is an incredibly fast running back. So when we think about everything, I do think that he, because of his lack of first round draft capital, as well as his size, that does keep him from being an S tier running back. But I still think he's a premier asset at the running back position. He's one of the more talented, definitely one of the more explosive running backs. And I think he's a really safe floor guy and a really high ceiling guy. And so, yeah, as far as his dynasty outlook, I think he's going to be a regular top 10 contributor as long as he still has Tua and Mike McDaniel. And with him only being in his second year in the NFL and only 23 years and 1 month old, he still has a long career ahead of him. And I think he'll be a regular contributor in the top 10. Now, my running back 5 is Saquon Barkley. I do have him in the B tier. So he's 27.8 years old, but he does have a BMI of 31.6. So that definitely is going to make him a featured back. He's been a featured back for the entirety of his career. So he did sign a 3-year deal this offseason with the Eagles. So what that generally means is that, and it's structured that he's probably going to play 2 of those seasons. But if he continues to look as good as he has this season, he's going to end up playing 3 or potentially even more if he doesn't show any signs of slowing down. He's used in the passing game and the running game. He has Jalen Hurts as his long-term quarterback. He has offensive talent around him in Dallas Goedert, A.J. Brown, and Devontae Smith. He has a fantastic offensive line, even with Kelsey retiring at center. And so there is nothing stopping him for the foreseeable future in terms of probably the next season or 2 of being the RB1 overall. But he is 27.8 years old, much older than any of these other running backs. So the shelf life is almost certainly not going to be that of the previous running backs mentioned. But still, as far as this season and probably next, potentially more, but probably for the next 2 seasons, he has legitimate RB1 overall upside, and he is reasonably likely to be the RB1 as well. And another thing is I view running backs in 2 to 3 year windows. And if I can view in more than that, you're going to be a lot higher in these rankings. And that's part of what makes the 4 running backs I previously mentioned better bets, is that they're either still on their first contract and have multiple years left, or they're really likely to get a second contract, but they're not even there yet. When we think about Saquon Barkley, he's been the RB1 before, he's been the RB5, he's currently the RB1. And so we know that he's a really talented running back. He was considered a generational running back coming out, whatever that means nowadays. He was really good, though, definitely one of the best. Bijan Robinson was also considered generational. I don't know how you can have that many generational players, but nonetheless, I don't mean that to discredit how talented he is. He's really good. When we take a look at his rush attempts, his 223 are first, his 1392 rushing yards are also first, his PFF rushing grade of 87.0 is 6th, his yards after contact per attempt of 3.48 is 10th, his missed tackles forced of 38 is tied for 7th, his 10-plus rushes of 29 are first, his breakaway run percentage of 46.6 is tied for 2nd, his PFF receiving grade of 71.2 is tied for 12th, his 30 targets are tied for 22nd, his 27 receptions are tied for 19th, his 257 receiving yards are 12th, his yards per out run of 1.22 are tied for 21st, and his 12 total touchdowns are 2nd. So yeah, he probably has at the very least 2 seasons left, including this season, potentially more. He's on a fantastic offense. I don't think that will change anytime soon. He's a featured back, and he's one of, if not the most talented running backs in the NFL. And so I do think he's at the top of the B tier. And if he were a little bit younger, if he was, say, 3 years younger, he would be my running back 1. My dynasty running back 6 is Kenneth Walker III of the Seahawks. So he's 5'9", 211. That gives him a 31.2 BMI, well over the threshold of 30.0. He in his rookie season was a featured back for a decent amount of the season. Even though they did add in 2023 a second round pick, Zach Charbonnet, and I was worried about his workload, it really didn't affect it. Charbonnet is basically a breather back who is a featured back when Walker goes down, but isn't doing anything to his workload. He was selected in the second round, so just like with Breece Hall, he's in the third year of his 4-year contract. He is going to be a second round or a second contract running back for sure, and is still only 24 years and 1 month old, so still well below the maximum age of 28 in general when running backs have their peak production seasons. His situation immediately is pretty good. His offensive line is fine, but not tremendous or anything. His quarterback in Geno Smith is a question mark long term. Geno's 34 years old, but the offensive environment and offensive coordinator are great. We do have to worry potentially, though, that Ryan Grubb does leave for a head coaching job should he continue to call plays at a very high level and the offense look good. But in my opinion, he is the most talented rusher of the football in the NFL. It's just that he isn't one of the better receiving backs. He's fine. He does get some receiving work as well, especially this season in the Grubb offense. But I do think that his lack of elite receiving skills, combined with the lack of first-round draft capital and potential worry about his long-term situation, it does put him in this B tier with Saquon Barkley, even though Barkley's a little bit older than him, but still one of the premier assets at the running back position. So Kenneth Walker finished as the RB 18 and 17 in his first 2 seasons. He's currently the RB 16. He did miss a little bit of time this year, so that is going to be something to consider. It's happened every year of his NFL career so far. But like I said, one of the more talented rushers of the football, in my opinion, the most talented. The receiving work is fine. He's actually seen quite an increase in total production in terms of his targets and receptions and receiving yards this season comparatively to the first 2 seasons of his NFL career. But taking a look at his stats, his rush attempts of 129 are 25th, his 493 rushing yards are 29th, but his PFF rushing grade of 91.5 is first. I don't use PFF like as the end all be all. If they said, oh, this guy is number 1, oh, okay, they're just number 1. That's not how I'm using it. I'm using that as confirmation that what I think is probably true. And so I do think that he is the most talented rusher of the football. PFF does happen to agree. His yards after contact per attempt of 3.11 is tied for 20th, but his missed tackles forced to 53 are first. And he's missed time this season. He is so elusive. His explosive rushes, his 10 plus of 10 are tied for 31st. His breakaway run percentage of 26.4 is 23rd. His PFF receiving grade, though, has actually been really good. He has definitely improved as a receiver this season, but I still wouldn't consider him one of the elite receiving backs. I think it's just that he's getting featured a lot. But his PFF receiving grade of 74.3 is 9th. His 41 targets are tied for 8th. His 36 receptions are 7th. His 274 receiving yards are 10th. His 1.40 yards per out run are 16th. And his 8 total touchdowns are 8th. And so we have somebody with incredible upside, but a reasonably low floor. His offensive line isn't the best. His long-term quarterback situation is something you have to worry about with Geno Smith. But for the immediate future of this year and probably next year, I'm really not worried. And like I said, I generally view running backs in 2-year increments. But I do think he's going to be a second contract running back for sure. I'd expect them to re-sign him. And I do think he's one of the more talented, but in my opinion, the most talented rusher of the football. And that, combined with him seeing a lot more work in the receiving game, I do think gives him a ton of upside. And should he stay healthy, I definitely think he's a top 10 running back. And so for that reason, I have him in the B tier as my RB6 overall in Dynasty. My RB7 in Dynasty is Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams. So he's 5'9", 194. That gives him only a 28.6 BMI, well below the 30.0 threshold. But just like I said with McCaffrey, that's not the end-all be-all in the sense of if a team is going to decide to use you as a bell cow back. This season and this past season, he's been a featured back. His rookie season, he wasn't really used at all. I really liked him in college, but when I saw his athletic measurables at the Combine, I was incredibly discouraged and wanted nothing to do with him. That was a huge mistake. I think a lot of people also fell for that too, because generally, this guy is an outlier for sure. Generally, running backs that aren't great athletes by NFL standards aren't going to be very good in the NFL, but he's a great fit for the offense. And more importantly, Sean McVay loves him. When we think about his situation, I think for the short term, it's really good, elite. But for the long term, there are some question marks. They did draft Blake Corum this year in the 3rd round, but he hasn't really seeped into his utilization very much. He's seen at most about 10% of the snaps, maybe 11%, so nothing too crazy there. He really doesn't eat into his workload at all. Now, Kyren is 24 years and 2 months old, so still relatively young. I do think he's going to be a second contract running back. I don't know if it's going to be with the Rams, though, because in the past, Sean McVay has said that he's not going to sign another running back like he did Todd Gurley. That was a disaster. He also has 5th-round draft capital. It's really not very good. That's fine, I guess. And he's also in the 3rd year of his 4-year rookie contract. So I do expect this year and next year for him to be an elite running back for us in fantasy. And like I said, 2-year windows for running backs in general, unless you're an elite guy in a great situation. But I do think that with Matt Stafford being a little bit older, Sean McVay saying, kind of wavering on his retirement, the possibility, and in my opinion, probability that they don't re-sign him long-term, that does give him a level of risk that some of the running backs in the A tier don't have. And I don't think he's quite as talented as Kenneth Walker or certainly Saquon Barkley. And so that is why I have him as a running back 7. All right, so like I said, in his rookie season, he wasn't used at all. He was the running back 88. Now, this past season, he started to be a featured back. He looked great. He did miss time with injury, though. He played 12 games, but he still finished as the RB7. He was the RB2 in points per game this past season. That's dipped a little bit this season. But he's still the running back 10. So still, like I said, a top 10 option. Now, among running backs with 50-plus attempts, his 207 rush attempts rank 3rd. Heavy utilization. Usage is king at the running back position. His 822 rush yards are 6th. His PFF rushing grade, though, of 67.5 is 36th. That's much lower than this past season. His yards after contact per attempt of 2.67 are 41st. His 32 missed tackles forced are 15th. His 15 explosive rushes are tied for 16th. His breakaway run percentage of 11.2 is 46th. His PFF receiving grade of 56.0 is tied for 40th. His 29 targets are tied for 26th. His 25 receptions are tied for 23rd. His 136 receiving yards are 30th. His 0.52 yards per hour run are 48th. But his 11 total touchdowns are 3rd. Now, I do think that the lack of a lot of passing game utilization does lower his ceiling, but he is a prolific touchdown scorer. He's very good in the red zone. And with him receiving such a large amount of volume, I do think that makes him a B-tier running back. But because he's less talented, and I don't think he's going to be in this situation long term, I do think he's going to go somewhere else. That does put him a tick below some of the other running backs, but still one of the better assets at the running back position. My Dynasty running back 8 is Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. Now, from tiers S through B, I do think that the order is important, and I do have them in those specific orders and in their own tiers as well. From this point on, if any running back is in any specific tier, I really don't care per se very much at all, really, who you have first or last, at least in my opinion. Like I said, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of disagreement. I'm sure that you have your reasons as to why you have somebody ahead of somebody else, and I'm sure they're valid. This is just my opinion. But from this point on, if any running back is in the same tier as another, I really don't care about the order. So Jonathan Taylor is 5'10", 226. That gives him a 32.4 BMI. That is ridiculous. Ridiculous. So he was selected in the 2nd round in the 2020 NFL Draft. He did sign an extension this past year, so he's in the 2nd year of his contract, in his 2nd contract. There is a potential out in 2026, so it's really just this year and next year that he's guaranteed a job in Indianapolis. And he's 25.8 years old, so approaching the age of 28, in which is the last year historically that running backs have peak production seasons. After his 1st and 2nd seasons, he has trailed off a little bit. I still think he's one of the more talented runners of the football. He isn't the best receiving back. And when we think about a situation, it's a little bit interesting. So I do think that Anthony Richardson is better than people give him credit for. His accuracy isn't the best. His decision-making when he gets pressured definitely isn't great either. I do think, though, that he has the ability to work out as a mid-level starter. Whether or not that happens, that's part of the risk for sure. The offensive line around him is good, though, and Shane Steichen, his offensive-minded head coach, is fantastic. So the situation is probably fine. I mean, like I said, 2-year windows with these running backs. I do expect them to give A-Rich this year and next year, so I think that's going to be his quarterback for sure the next 2 seasons, and that's all I'm really concerned about, especially with a running back that's almost 26 years old. So his situation is pretty good. So like I said, after a really strong start to his NFL career with a running back 6 and RB1 finish, he's trailed off a little bit. It's been due to injury and holdout specifically in 2023, though. Right now, he's a high-end RB3. I do expect that to improve for him, though. He's one of the more talented runners of the football. When we take a look at his production, his 161 rush attempts are 15th, his 708 rushing yards are 15th, his 57.2 rushing grade is 51st, his 2.81 yards after contact per attempt are 39th, his 19 missed tackles forced are 34th, but here's where his skills come into play. He has 21 rushes of 10 or more yards, which is tied for 8th, and he has a 39.1% breakaway run percentage, which is 5th. So he's more of a big chunk gain type of running back rather than, a make you miss every single play, elite, short space, a short agility type of running back. When we take a look at his receiving production, his PFF receiving grade of 33.3 is 54th. His 21 targets are 34th. His 13 receptions are 38th. His 111 receiving yards are 36th. And his yards per out run of 0.63 are 43rd. And his 5 total touchdowns are 21st. So he isn't having the best season. And like I said, a decent amount of his valuation here is due to community sentiment on him. He's generally viewed as one of the better running backs. I do think that he's better than his current running back finish suggests in some of these stats, but he definitely has depreciated in value after a tremendous first 2 seasons. But I do think he's going to finish out the year strong. I think they're going to give him a heavy workload, and I do think that he's going to continue to provide us value for this season and next season. My Dynasty running back 9 is James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. So he's 5'11", 199. That does give him only a 27.8 BMI, just like with Devon Achane. He was selected in the second round, albeit the end of the second round in 2022. And so that means he's in year 3 of 4 of his rookie contract. I do think that he's a second contract running back, but I don't think he's going to demand top shelf free agency money. He's 25 years and 1 month old, so still has 3 years below the, in general, maximum age of peak running back production. When we think about his situation, it's fantastic. He has Josh Allen as his QB. He has decent pieces around him. Now, they did draft Ray Davis, who's looked pretty good, but he hasn't really seeped into his usage too much. And so I do think that, once again, I only look at generally 2-year windows for running backs, that his situation is really good for this year and next year. I don't know if they'll re-sign him specifically, but he will play somewhere else for sure. He's looked really good in spurts. And when we think about his production, he does give us RB1 weeks here and there, but the floor isn't quite as high as some of these other running backs ahead of him. So James Cook is one of those running backs that I think is kind of like Kyren, where the situation is helping him be a little bit better than he is, but it doesn't really matter. He's going to produce because of the situation. This past year, he was the RB12. This year, he's the RB13. He had a strong finish to the end of the year this past year, and then he's kind of been booned by rushing touchdowns this year. He does give us some high highs, but the lows are pretty low. When you take a look at his stats, his 137 rush attempts are 23rd, his 596 rushing yards are 22nd, his 80.2 PFF rushing grade is 13th, his 2.86 yards after contact per attempt are tied for 36th, his 23 missed tackles forced are tied for 23rd, his explosive rushes of 14 are tied for 21st, his breakaway run percentage of 19.8% is 34th, his PFF receiving grade of 51.7 is 45th. His 31 targets are 21st. His 25 receptions are tied for 23rd. His 182 receiving yards are 24th. His yards per out run of 1.10 is 24th. And his 11 total touchdowns are 3rd. So like I said, kind of like Kyren Williams, I think that the situation is helping him be a little bit better for us in fantasy than he really is as a player. But given that he's now in year 3 of 4 of his rookie contract, he's likely to get a second contract somewhere. And with his short-term situation being really, really good for his production, and Ray Davis not really eating into his role tremendously and him still scoring rushing touchdowns, I do think that makes him a top 10 fantasy back at this current moment in time. But I do think that with the incoming class of running backs that he's going to be pushed down quite a bit after this year. But for right now, I do view him as a top 10 running back. My Dynasty RB10 is Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. So he's 5'10", 220 with a 31.6 BMI. That's over the 30.0 threshold. He has been and continues to be a featured back. He's 26 years and 8 months old. He did sign a contract with Green Bay this offseason. It was a 3-year deal that's probably 2, so this year and next year. His situation in the next 2 seasons is fantastic. He has Jordan Love, a young receiving core, a great offensive-minded head coach, and the touch competition is practically non-existent comparatively to a lot of other running back tandems. And so for that reason, I do think that makes him a top 10 back right now. When we take a look at his production this year, among running backs with 50-plus rush attempts, his 202 rush attempts rank 4th, his 944 rushing yards are 3rd, his PFF rushing grade of 89.4 is 4th, his yards after contact per attempt of 3.58 are tied for 4th, his 46 missed tackles are 4th, his explosive rushes of 10 or more yards of 25 are tied for 3rd, his breakaway run percentage of 23.7 is 29th, his 75.0 PFF receiving grade is 7th, his 28 targets are 29th, his 23 receptions are tied for 27th, his 186 receiving yards are 22nd, his 1.02 yards per out run is 30th, and his 8 total touchdowns are 8th. So he's a complete back in that he can be used in the passing game as well on the ground. He's a featured back. Now, because he is approaching 27 and historically 28 is the cutoff point for running back production, as well as that he's not on his rookie contract, I do have him a little bit lower than some of the backs ahead of him, but he's really a talented back, especially when running the football, and he's definitely improved as a receiver throughout his career. And with the short-term situation being so good, I definitely think that he's a top 10 back. It's just, is Father Time going to catch up to him? He's gotten a lot of work in his career. But yeah, really talented back, and he's my running back 10. My Dynasty running back 11 is Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. So he's 5'10", 214. That gives him a 30.7 BMI. He does have the ability to be a bell cow back, and after Mark Ingram left, he's been a bell cow back in New Orleans. So he's 29 years and 3 months old, historically past the production maximum peak age of 28, but he really hasn't slowed down. He's regressed a little bit as a rusher, but definitely not as a receiver. He still remains one of the most talented backs. He definitely appears to be in line for work this season and next season, and like I said, 2-year windows for running backs, and he's giving you elite running back 1 production right now. The situation isn't particularly great, but it really doesn't matter. He's being fed the ball a tremendous amount each and every week and is one of the more talented backs, and especially as a receiver. So running back Alvin Kamara has been the RB16 or better in a full PPR setting every single year of his career. And even though he finished as the RB11 this past season, he missed some time, and so he would have finished higher than that. He's currently the RB3. He's really not slowing down very much, especially as a receiver. As a runner, he's not quite what he used to be, but still really good. When we think about how he's performed this season, his 183 rush attempts are 8th, his 782 rushing yards are 11th, his PFF rushing grade of 77.2 is 19th, his yards after contact per attempt of 2.69 is 40th, his missed tackles forced of 29 is tied for 17th, his explosive rushes of 19 is 13th, his breakaway run percentage of 21.1% is 33rd, his PFF receiving grade of 63.4 is 27th. His 71 targets, though, are first, 55 receptions are first, 443 receiving yards are first, 1.83 yards per out run are third, and 7 total touchdowns are 13th. He's had some massive weeks as well as some low floor weeks. I do think that he's going to be an RB1 down the stretch for us. And like I said, 2-year windows for running backs. And so I do think that he's going to be this year and next year a top 10 running back for us in fantasy football. But because of age, he is slightly outside my top 10. But like I said, with this tier and below of running backs, I really don't care where you have him in this tier. I just consider him in this tier. My Dynasty RB12 is Joe Mixon of the Houston Texans. So he's 6'1", 228. That gives him a 30.1 BMI. That's 53rd. His age of 28.3 is slightly past the maximum age in general when running backs have a peak production season. But he's having a peak production season right now in Houston. So he signed a 3-year deal. He's in the first year of his 3-year deal. He's likely to play 2 of them this year and next year. His short-term situation with CJ Stroud, Nico Collins, Tank Dell is fantastic. The scheme with Bobby Slowick is great. Bobby Slowick, there is a potential for him to leave, so that is something that that is a potential risk for him. But in terms of winning you your fantasy football leagues, this guy can get it done this year and I think next year. He's had 2 weeks where I believe so far, where he hasn't been fantastic, but he's basically a walking 20+ point game this year. And that is what you need to win your fantasy football leagues. And so for all of these reasons, I do think that he's a top 15 running back. And like I said, I don't really care where in this tier you have him. I understand that with some of these guys, people are going to be more inclined to think about, oh, but this guy's old. Why is he in this tier? I do have some running backs that are much younger and with a lot of promise in tiers below. But like I said, I think of running back production in 2-year windows. He's going to get it done this year. He's probably getting it done next year. Beyond that, I really don't care, to be honest with you. And it's kind of the inverse of wide receivers. With wide receivers, I value age a ton more than I do age in running backs, unless you're somebody like Bijan or Gibbs, where they're round 1 pick with basically 5 to 6 years of guaranteed production for their team. This isn't the case for Joe Mixon, but I still think he's talented enough in such a great situation that he does deserve to be in this C tier of running backs. When we think about his production, he's been a top 10 running back in 5 seasons, if you include this one so far, including, if you include the season, each of the past 4. So he's been tremendous for us. When you take a look at his production this season, his 185 rush attempts ranked 6th, and that's with him missing a couple games. His 786 rushing yards are 9th. His PFF rushing grade of 73.8 is 25th. His yards after contact per attempt of 2.87 are 35th. His 26 missed tackles forced are 22nd. But here's where it gets good. His explosive rushes of 10+ yards of 21 are tied for 8th, which is even more impressive when you think about that he's missed some time. His breakaway run percentage of 32.6 is 12th. His PFF receiving grade of 68.8 is 16th. His 32 targets are tied for 18th. His 23 receptions are tied for 27th. His 226 receiving yards are 17th, and his 1.4 yards per out run is tied for 16th, with 11 total touchdowns, which is 3rd. This guy is a touchdown machine in this offense. I expect that to continue down the stretch this season and next year, and I do think that he's going to be a threat to be a top 10 running back this season and next season. My Dynasty RB 13 is Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens. So he's 6'3", 247. That gives him a 30.9 BMI. This guy is a massive human being. He was drafted way back in 2016, so he's been around for quite some time. He's 30 years and 9 months old, so almost 31. But he really isn't showing any signs of decline. I understand a lot of people are going to criticize, oh, he's old. He's getting it done this year. He's probably playing next year. He isn't showing any signs of slowing down. And in general, while I would be way more concerned with the 30-something-year-old running back, this guy spends a ton of money on his body. He's in a great situation. He doesn't look any worse for the wear, even at over 30 years old. And when we think about his situation, he has Lamar Jackson as his QB. He has playmakers all around him in Baltimore, a decent run-blocking line, and he looks fantastic, and he is built for massive amounts of work in which he has received for the entirety of his career. And so when you put all these factors in together, I do think that he is right in this C tier, and I think you could have him anywhere in this tier because he is a league-winning running back. When we think about how Derrick Henry's performed throughout his career, he's been a threat to be the RB1. He hasn't quite finished as it yet in any individual year, but he's finished as a top 10 back if you include this year in each of the past 3 seasons. When you take a look at his workload, his 221 rush attempts are 2nd, 1325 rushing yards are 2nd, 91.3 PFF rushing grade is 2nd. His 3.55 yards after contact per attempt is tied for 6th. His 44 missed tackles are 5th. 27 explosive runs are 2nd. 45.3% breakaway run percentage is 1st. His PFF receiving grade of 62.4 is 28th. He's never been the best receiver. He's just been so dominant on the ground that it doesn't matter. His 11 targets are tied for 43rd. His 10 receptions are tied for 41st. His 96 receiving yards are 41st. His 0.83 yards per out run is 35th, but his 15 total touchdowns are 1st. This guy is getting it done despite doing nothing in the receiving game, which makes his RB2 current finish right now even more impressive. Like I said, he's really shown no signs of decline. And so I understand where ageism is going to come into play with some people's rankings, and they're really not going to like this. But I think for this year and next year, he is a real threat to be the RB1 overall. He is a dominant force in a fantastic situation, and I really don't see him slowing down this year. He could bust at any time, but since he's not showing any signs of decline, I still think that he is right here in the C tier and is one of the best assets for win now production at the running back position. My Dynasty RB14 is Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. Now, I'll be real with you. This ranking is purely based on market sentiment, people's opinions of Christian McCaffrey. I know there are people that are worried about him. Is he still good? Blah, blah, blah. A high amount of the community still loves and believes in Christian McCaffrey. I personally think that he's starting to age out. Obviously, these past 2 years, he's been able to stay healthy, but before that, he hadn't been. And I think people forget that. This man is 28 years and 4 months old, so getting on the older side, 5'11", 202, that gives him a 28.2 BMI. That's really not that great. But you know what is great is his situation. And he's still a good player. But I do think he's declining, and I really worry that Garendo is, and potentially Jordan Mason, depending, could potentially start to eat into his workload this next season, even though the 49ers generally use a featured back. But as far as his situation, it's just about as good as it gets. The line isn't great, but the playmakers around him are. He has Brock Purdy and Kyle Shanahan. You really, in general, can't ask for a much better situation, and he's really talented himself. Now, he's been one of the most talented and complete running backs in both the rushing and receiving game. This past year, even he was the running back 1. The year before that, the RB2. He did have a couple of injury-riddled years, the couple years before that, but before that, he was RB1 and 2. We all know that he's been the best running back in the NFL. Now, he's been dealing with Achilles tendonitis in both legs, and so I do think that's starting to wear down on him. He doesn't, in my opinion, look like the same guy on the ground. Jordan Mason and Isaac Garendo were having no problem with their yards per carry behind the line, but he's been abysmal so far. Now, I will give him a break when Brock Purdy was out, but still, and another thing, I don't really have any data for him because he hasn't played enough this season for it to really mean anything. But I do think he's a declining player. I still think he's just as good in the receiving game, but I think as a runner of the football, he's definitely declining. I don't have him in any leagues, but if I did, I would definitely be looking to cash out right now because I do think he's starting to decline. And like I said, this ranking is purely based off what I think is community valuation would be in general. I still think that people view him as a league-winning running back. I personally don't. But because of that, that is why he's going to be here in these rankings. Now, my running back 15 is Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers. This one might get some disagreement as well, but I'll explain why I think this. So he's 6'2" that gives him a 28.2 BMI. I do think he's put on some weight, so I don't think the BMI is quite accurate in terms of right now, but he's not a huge back in terms of bulky or anything. Now, he's 25 years and 4 months old, but he was just signed to an extension. I really like that he's with Dave Canales in Carolina. I think that Bryce Young can be a slightly below to average QB at the NFL level, but I love the Canales scheme. I think what they're going to do is they're going to turn him and Jonathon Brooks into a David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs type of situation. I think it's going to be a poor man's version of that, though. But with him just receiving the extension and looking really good this year, as well as having one of the better run-blocking offensive lines up front, I do think he's in a perfect situation to maximize his talent and produce for us in fantasy football, but he definitely is going to be part of a tandem. Now, he's always been an underrated running back, but I definitely didn't think he was this good. This year, he has been nothing short of fantastic. He is right now the running back 12, which is incredible. Great value for anybody if you have him. When you take a look at his production, he's been great. His 177 rush attempts are 10th, 876 rushing yards are 5th. PFF rushing grade of 88.6 is also 5th. His yards after contact per attempt of 3.55 is tied for 6th. His 35 missed tackles forced are tied for 10th. His 20 explosive rushes are tied for 11th. His breakaway run percentage of 31.2 is 13th. His PFF receiving grade of 38.8 is 53rd, though. His 38 targets are tied for 10th. His 31 receptions are tied for 13th. His 126 receiving yards are tied for 33rd. His 0.56 yards per out run is 46th. And his 8 total touchdowns are 8th. Like I said, I think he's an above average running back, but not an elite one. In a great situation, he was just signed to an extension. I love the offensive line. And I think for the next 2 seasons, he's going to be great for us in fantasy football. As the David Montgomery, poor man's David Montgomery, to Jonathon Brooks, Jahmyr Gibbs in the Carolina Panthers backfield. My RB16 is Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. So he's 5'10", 209. That gives him a 30.0 BMI, right at the minimum threshold that we'd like for a featured back. Once Zach Moss went on IR, he's been a featured back. They did trade for Khalil Herbert, so we'll have to see if he starts to eat into his utilization. So far, no worries. He's 24 years and 7 months old, and he was drafted in 2023, so that means that he has 25 and 26 on his rookie contract, so no worries there. The next 2 years look good for him. He's in Cincinnati. It's a great offense with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. T. Higgins might be leaving. They have Andre Iosivas, though. And so with a decent line as well. So I do think that he's set up for success. It's just there is the potential, due to him only having 5th round draft capital and the latter half of that they do draft or sign a running back. So that is something to worry about. But for now, he's in a great spot. So last year, he really didn't do too much. This year, though, he's the RB18 and really picking it up after the departure of Zach Moss due to injury. When we take a look at his stats this season, his 140 rush attempts are tied for 21st. His 607 rushing yards are 20th. His 75.0 PFF rushing grade is 22nd. His yards after contact per attempt of 2.94 tied for 30th. His 29 missed tackles forced are tied for 17th. His explosive rushes of 15 are tied for 16th. His breakaway run percentage of 25% is 27th. His 66.8 PFF receiving grade is 19th, but this is where he's really valuable. His 42 targets are 7th. His 35 receptions are 8th. His 207 receiving yards are 18th. And his 1.10 yards per route run is tied for 25th, with 7 total touchdowns was his 13th. His stats would be a lot better if Zach Moss hadn't been there this season. He's really picked it up since then. I think he's a really talented back. And I do think that as long as they don't draft somebody that's an elite RB1 type, that he does have a lot of potential this year and next year. Like I always say, and I've said throughout this entire video, 2-year windows with running backs. And for the next 2 seasons, he's on his rookie contract in Cincinnati. They should use him quite a bit, and he's really talented. And so I think he should still continue to be at worst an RB2, but with a lot more potential than that if they don't fill in the running back room with a high-end running back. My Dynasty RB17 is Jonathon Brooks of the Carolina Panthers. So he's 6', 216 with a 29.3 BMI. Now, the Panthers traded up in the NFL draft to draft this guy this season. So he's a rookie, obviously. He is coming off a torn ACL. He just got some work this past week, 2 carries for 7 yards. So he's still getting eased into the offense. I do think that he's going to be a Jonathon Brooks light, or Jahmyr Gibbs light type of player. And so I do have him still ranked here in these rankings, but he's probably almost certainly never going to be a featured back, at least for the next 2 seasons. I really believe in the talent, though. I love the Canales scheme. I think he's going to see a lot of the receiving work, and I think he's going to see Jahmyr Gibbs types of workload and be a slightly less effective player, because I don't think he's quite as good as Jahmyr Gibbs, but I think that's the type of player we have here. And with the team investment trading up into the 2nd round to draft him, I see no way that they don't give him a good amount of utilization in what should be a pretty good offense with a fantastic offensive line. So, like I said, was coming off a torn ACL, so he has only played in 1 game, had 2 carries for 7 yards. I don't really have any stats for you because that's obviously not enough of a sample size to give you any meaningful data. But like I said, I really like the situation. I really believe in the talent. My NFL comp for him was an Aaron Jones type of running back. He's really elusive. He's incredible after the catch. I think he's going to be an above average receiving back. And I think he's going to, because of the lack of bell cow utilization, I think that's really going to extend his shelf life at the running back or at the NFL level. And so I do think that he's going to be probably a top 15 running back, but more along the lines of the RB15 type of range, where he's going to be a definite starter for you as an RB2, but I don't think unless there's an injury to Chuba Hubbard or if they were to release Chuba Hubbard or if he goes down, him ever really be a top 10 back given them re-signing Chuba. But I really like the situation for him. I think he's a really talented player, and I think he's going to be around for a long time. My Dynasty RB 18 is going to be Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals. So he's 6 foot 216. That gives him a 29.3 BMI. I really think he plays more at 6 foot, about 222 to 225, though. I think he slimmed down a little bit to give himself a better 40-yard dash time. By the way, he ran a 4.39 at that size. Yeah. So he was selected in the top of the 3rd round in this year's draft. The situation short term wasn't great. They have James Conner, but James Conner's on the final year of his contract. I really doubt they re-sign him. Even if they do, though, the team investment should be enough that they give him a good amount of run. They've started giving him drives to spell James Conner now at this point in the season, and he's looking way better than Conner. And he's only 22 years and 3 months old, so he still has a long career ahead of him. I do think he's going to take over. The situation is pretty good. They have a good line. They have Kyler Murray at quarterback, MHJ and Trey McBride as receivers. Petzing, the OC, is fine, I guess, but for running back production, he's pretty good. They do prefer to run the ball whenever possible. They've had a stretch of games in which they've been able to do so before this past week. And so I think he's really starting to show that he's a good talent at the NFL level, and he's an incredibly explosive runner who I compared to a Breece Hall light type of player. This guy is really good, and I think this next season, he's going to see a massive uptick in production and dynasty value. Now, when we think about his production, he hasn't been incredible in terms of the total output, but he's averaging 4.42 yards per carry. He's been, and that's considering in week 2 to close the game, it was a way lopsided game. They were just running him in an obvious run situation that really skewed the stats. This guy has had over 5 yards per carry in a majority of the games so far in his career. And now some of these stats aren't that impressive, but when you consider the lack of volume as opposed to where he's finishing in some of these stats, I think that paints a better picture as to how good he is. Now, he's only had 54 rush attempts, which is 54th, but he has 234 rushing yards, which is 48th. So more yards compared to the rest of the league than where he is in rush attempts. His PFF receiving or rushing grade rather of 57 is 52nd. A lot of that is skewed by a terrible week 2. His yards after contact per attempt of 3.15 is 17th though, so that's great. His 11 missed tackles forced is 47th, but that's not bad at all when you consider he's only had 53 rush attempts. His 8 explosive runs are 36th, but he's 54th in rush attempts. His breakaway run percentage of 15.8% is 41st. He's more of a consistent chunk gainer, but he does have the ever so explosive ability to break any run. His PFF receiving grade of 74.2 is 10th, but to be fair, that is on a limited sample size. His 5 targets are tied for 50th. His 5 receptions are 50th. His 55 receiving yards are 46th. His yards per out run of 1.77, though, even though it's a limited sample size, are 4th. And his 1 touchdown is 57th. I think this guy is going to have a massive uptick in production this next season. And even if they decide to re-sign James Conner, he is going to take over the lion's share of the rush attempts, and he's a really good receiving back. I think this guy is going to see a massive uptick in value as soon as this next season. All we have to do is hope that they don't draft another high-end running back. I don't think they will because they have a ton of holes, but it is possible. My Dynasty RB 19 is Bucky Irving. He, like Jahmyr Gibbs and Jonathon Brooks, I don't suspect are going to be featured backs. He's 5'9", 192. That gives him only a 28.4 BMI. But he's a really talented running back, one of the more talented backs in the NFL. He was drafted in the 4th round in this year's draft, so he doesn't have a ton of draft capital associated with him. But I definitely don't think they're going to be replacing him. And he's only 22 years and 2 months old, so still really, really young. He has 4 years left, including this year, on his rookie contract. The situation with Baker Mayfield, Mike Evans aging, Chris Godwin being a free agent and injured for the year, along with them having Rachaad White probably for one more season, is going to limit his upside. But I think the biggest factor here is I do think that offensive coordinator Liam Cohen leaves. And so I think that's going to really hurt the entirety of this Buccaneers offense. I still think he's going to be a really good back, but I do think that we are going to see a decline in production compared to what we've seen this year and next year. And so, like I said, I know people are going to disagree with this and have him a lot higher in their rankings. It's fine. We can agree to disagree. Really talented player, but I do worry about the situation as soon as this next season because I do expect some regression from the entirety of this Buccaneers offense. So he's currently the running back 21. He's having a great year, and he's a really good player. His 108 rush attempts rank 30th. His 579 rushing yards are 24th. His 80.1 PFF rushing grade is tied for 15th. His 4.19 yards after contact per attempt are second. His 34 missed tackles forced are 13th. His explosive rushes of 14 are tied for 21st. His breakaway run percentage of 36.4 is 8th. His 90.5 PFF receiving grade is 1st. His 33 targets are 16th. His 32 receptions are tied for 11th. His 252 receiving yards are 14th. His 1.66 yards per out run are 6th. And his 5 touchdowns are 21st. Like I said, really good player, a complete running back. Probably never going to be used as a featured back. I do expect the offense to regress, but I do think he's going to be here as a running back too to stay for a couple more seasons. I just do think that the whole offense is going to decline because I'm thinking that Liam Cohen leaves. But if he doesn't, then he is going to be bumped up these rankings because he does have the potential to finish as a high-end RB2 if he continues to be this efficient this next season. But I do have my concerns about his long-term future, but it's really not his fault. My Dynasty running back 20 is David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. So he's 5'10", 222 pounds. That gives him a 31.9 BMI. This guy's a massive human being, and he's really, really good. When you see some of his advanced stats, you're going to be in awe if you don't know already. So he's 27 years and 4 months old. He just was signed into an extension, so he's here to stay for the next 2 years in Detroit. It's as good of a situation as you could possibly imagine, and he's a really consistent threat to score a touchdown basically every single week. I do think, though, that their offensive coordinator is probably going to leave in Ben Johnson, so I do think he's going to see some decline in production, just like with Gibbs. But he is such a good running back in such a good situation that even with a decrease in total efficiency due to the probability of the play calling not being quite as good, that he's still going to be a consistent threat for us and an every week start for us at running back. Yeah, there really isn't much more to say. The situation is that of Jahmyr Gibbs, basically. Really good player, and I do think he's here to stay for the next 2 seasons as a must-start running back. So David Montgomery is the RB11 right now. He hasn't finished as a top 10 running back except for his second season in the NFL in Chicago, but he's been an RB2 for us in general the past 2 seasons. He's a really talented player, and he's really showing out this season. A lot of it is due to running back touchdown production, but I don't see that really declining too much. His rush attempts of 145 are 20th. His 632 rushing yards are tied for 18th. His 80.2 PFF rushing grade is tied for 13th. His yards after contact per attempt of 3.27 is 13th. His 36 missed tackles are 9th, so really good so far. His explosive rushes of 10 or more yards of 14 is tied for 21st. His 14.1 breakaway run percentage is 43rd, though. More of a consistent mover than per se an explosive runner, and that's what makes him and Gibbs a really good complement to each other. His PFF receiving grade, though, is great, and he's been great through the air this year. His 84.9 is 3rd. His 25 targets, though, are 32nd. 24 receptions are 26th. 241 receiving yards are 16th. But his 2.13 yards per out run are 2nd, and his 11 total touchdowns are 3rd. This guy is a decent ceiling, but really high floor running back in a great offense that gets a ton of volume. They prefer to run the ball, and that's what makes him and Gibbs such great assets for us in Dynasty. And I think this guy is here to stay as a running back too for at least 2 more seasons. My Dynasty RB21 is Tyrone Tracy of the New York Giants. So he's 5'11", 209 pounds. It gives him a 29.1 BMI. That is below the 30.0 threshold, but it's not ridiculously concerning. He has seen some featured back utilization until recently once he's had a couple fumbles. He was selected at the end of the 5th round this season, and he's 25 years old as a rookie. Definitely an older player. He was a converted wide receiver in college. I think he's a really talented player. I do think he's better than Devin Singletary. Now, the question is the long-term outlook. There isn't a ton of team commitment to him, and the situation right now at QB is terrible. The offensive line isn't the best. It's actually one of the worst. But he's a really good player. They are better at run blocking than pass blocking. Now, the short-term situation should get better. They have the number 1 pick as of right now. I do expect they're either going to draft Cam Ward or Shadur Sanders, which I understand this draft class of quarterbacks pales in comparison to 2024, but I do believe either one of those two quarterbacks are going to be better options than Daniel Jones or Tommy DeVito. I do think Drew Lock is a little bit underrated, but his ceiling definitely is capped for sure. I think he's a high-end backup, but I do expect the situation to improve, and I don't expect them, with all of the holes that they have, for them to really invest in running backs this next year, even though it's a good class. And so I do think he's going to be the starter in New York, but I do think he's going to cede a little bit of work at Devin Singletary, especially if he doesn't clean up the fumbles. If he doesn't clean up the fumbles, there is a legitimate possibility that he is not going to be the running back one on this team. So that is why I have him a little bit lower in these rankings than some people might in theirs. So right now he's the running back 31, at least in the point of me recording this video. I'm recording this video on Friday, so right after the Thanksgiving game. So some people will have had stats, but some people won't. So this is, once again, as you can see, through weeks 1 to 12. His 116 rush attempts are 28th. His 587 rush yards are 23rd. His 72.4 PFF rushing grade is 26th. His 3.17 yards after contact per attempt are 16th. His 22 missed tackles forced are tied for 25th. His 15 explosive rushes are 16th. His breakaway run percentage of 35.3 is 9th. His PFF receiving grade of 43.2 is 50th. He isn't quite as good of a receiving back as I would have thought, being a converted wide receiver, but he's definitely not terrible. His 26 targets are 31st. His 22 receptions are tied for 31st. His 145 receiving yards are 28th. His 0.81 yards per out run is 36th, and his 3 touchdowns are 33rd. Some of these stats aren't going to be as impressive as you might think, but it's because he started being the running back one midway through the season. He's had some really high highs and some low lows this year so far. The team commitment in him isn't extensive, so there is the possibility that he's replaced, or if he continues to fumble, there is the opportunity for Devin Singletary to overtake him. So there's definitely some risk here, but he is a talented player, and that's why I have him here in the Dynasty running back rankings. My Dynasty RB 22 is DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears. So he's 5'8", 212 pounds. It does give him a 32.2 BMI, which is fantastic. Was drafted in the second round of the 2020 NFL draft. He is on his second contract. He just signed with Chicago on a 3-year deal that's probably 2 years. This is the first year of that contract. He's 25 years and 8 months old, so below the, in general, last age of 28 in which running backs can have peak production. The situation is really good and really bad. At the point of me recording this video, the Bears just fired Matt Eberflus. Thank you. I don't know how it took this long. Now, Thomas Brown, the offensive coordinator, is the interim head coach. He's been very good for the play calling, but it's been more so helpful for Caleb Williams. Before that, DeAndre Swift was the offense. I do worry as to the future of the situation in terms of the scheme. So there is the possibility that things could break wrong for DeAndre Swift. But he's a really talented player. He's connected to Caleb Williams, which I like. He has Rome Odunze and DJ Moore for sure next season, maybe Keenan Allen and Cole Kmet. I do anticipate they draft heavily and invest into the offensive line via the draft and free agency. So I do think in that regard, the situation is going to improve. But without knowing who the head coach is going to be or what the scheme is going to be, there definitely is some concern for DeAndre Swift. So DeAndre Swift's peak season was the RB15 in his second year. After that, he's really been mid to low end RB2. I think that's going to continue. He has really high highs, but really low lows. He's not really the dominant running back that you might think somebody of his stature would be. His 168 rush attempts are 11th. His 665 rushing yards are 17th. His 65.2 PFF rushing grade is 43rd. His 2.49 yards after contact per attempt are 47th. His 27 missed tackles forced are tied for 20th. His 13 explosive rushes are tied for 26th. His 34.1 breakaway run percentage is 11th. His PFF receiving grade of 58.6 is 36th. His 35 targets are 14th. His 31 receptions are tied for 13th. His 278 receiving yards are 9th. His 1.24 yards per out run are 20th. And his 5 touchdowns are 21st. So a pretty talented running back who's a very good receiver, not an elite, but an above average wide receiving back at least, in what could be a really good situation, but there is some danger in that we don't know who's going to be the head coach in the OC. He could definitely fall out of favor. He's a little bit streaky as a player, but he does have a lot of upside. And so that's why I have him here in my rankings. My Dynasty RB23 is Isiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs. I do suspect this is another running back that people are going to have a lot further in their rankings than I do. So he's 5'10", 216 with a 31 BMI. That's great. He is one of the most aggressive runners of the football that I have ever seen in my entire life. He reminds me a lot of Marion Barber in that regard, but he has 7th round draft capital in 2022, so he's in the 3rd year of his 4-year contract. I don't really think Kansas City is going to extend him, to be honest. I don't think he's quite that good. He's a good running back. I don't mean it as a criticism as that he's a bad player or anything. He's 24 years and 7 months old, so almost 25. That's not really a concern, but he's been hurt this season. He doesn't have a lot of draft capital. And so I do think that, especially with this being a really good draft for running backs, that there's the potential that they draft a running back in Kansas City. But as far as the situation, it's great. He's probably this year, next year, going to see a good amount of utilization, assuming they don't draft a running back. And my reasoning for having him this low is because I do think that they draft one, and I think that's going to hurt him. So he finished as the RB15 this past year. This year he's been hurt. He's missed time in each of the past 2 seasons. It's because of how aggressive he is. I don't have any stats because he hasn't played enough to meet the 50-plus rush attempt minimum. Like I said, I think he's an above-average running back. He's one of the most aggressive players I've ever seen at the running back position. I do worry, though, due to lack of draft capital and team investment, and with the incoming class of really good running backs, that there is the opportunity that they draft a running back. We've already seen that they drafted Clyde Edwards-Helaire in the 1st round a couple of years ago. I don't think they're afraid with how strong their roster is overall to draft another running back. And so that is my reasoning for having him a little bit lower in these rankings. I suspect people are going to have him higher. But in the event that they don't draft a running back, and if they were to extend him, I definitely think he's going to be a top 15 back. But I do think he was overdrafted for us in fantasy this season. My Dynasty RB24 and the last running back in these rankings is Jaylen Wright of the Miami Dolphins. So he's 5'11", 210 pounds. That does give him a 29.3 BMI. This guy is the Raheem Mostert replacement for the Dolphins. So next season, expect him to have that complementary role where he receives more of the rush attempts, but isn't quite as involved in the passing game as Achane. Kind of like a David Montgomery type of player. But in the Miami Dolphins, the offense that gives you a ton of upside. So he was drafted in the 4th round, but they spent a next year's 3rd round pick to acquire him. And so that is a heavy amount of involvement, having future draft capital tied into him. And he's 21 years and 6 months old, so still a really young running back. He hasn't really done too much this season, but with Raheem Mostert definitely declining as a player and being well over, I believe it's 32 years old now, the runway is clear for Jaylen Wright. I really doubt the Dolphins invest in any more running backs. They could, but I do think that he's the Raheem Mostert next year, and I think that gives you a ton of upside. So his utilization this season hasn't been tremendous, but he was the RB3. We all knew that he was a play for next year and potentially beyond. His 59 rush attempts are 52nd, but he has 243 rushing yards, which are 45th, so more than his rush attempts. His 77.0 PFF rushing grade is 20th. So even on a limited sample size, this guy is a really good runner of the football. His yards after contact per attempt of 3.32 is 12th, so really tough yards after contact player. His 15 missed forced tackles are 39th, but when you consider his rush attempts, that's really good. His 8 explosive runs are tied for 36th. That's great. His 29.6 breakaway run percentage is 16th. Great. His PFF receiving grade, though, is bad. He's not really a good receiving back. He's kind of like a Mostert, but definitely worse than Mostert in the receiving game. His 3 targets are 53rd, 1 reception tied for 53rd, 2 receiving yards tied for 53rd, 0.03 yards per out run, 54th, and no total touchdowns. Like I said, a play for next year. Assuming they don't draft anybody in the upcoming NFL draft at the running back position, he's going to be good. I really don't expect them to, considering they traded a next year's 3rd for him, and he's been relatively good most of the games here in a limited sample size. So I do think that he's a play for next season, and I do think that we can expect potentially a low-end RB2 type of year for him if Achane doesn't miss any time. But next year, if Mostert's gone and Achane misses some time, this guy has league-winning potential at the running back position. And so to conclude, running backs that I think are in the S tier by themselves, we have Bijan and Gibbs. Running backs in the A tier are Breece and Achane. Running backs in the B tier are Saquon, Kenneth Walker III, and Kyren Williams. Now, remember, running backs in the C through E tier, I don't care where they are within the tier. If you disagree with this guy's here and this guy's there, it doesn't really matter to me. We have Jonathan Taylor, James Cook, Josh Jacobs, Alvin Kamara, Joe Mixon, and Derrick Henry. Running backs in the D tier are Christian McCaffrey, Chuba Hubbard, Chase Brown, Jonathon Brooks, Trey Benson, Bucky Irving, and David Montgomery. And then running backs in the E tier are Tyrone Tracy, DeAndre Swift, Isiah Pacheco, and Jaylen Wright. All right, so that concludes the top 24 Dynasty running back rankings. If you like what you've seen and heard, feel free to like and subscribe. It took about 10 to 11 hours for me to create all this, get all the information, record, edit it, and upload it. So if you like what you've seen and heard, just like and subscribe. And make sure you check out my wide receiver tier rankings. I have top 24 Dynasty wide receivers I released this past week. And in the coming weeks, I'm going to have tight end and quarterback rankings as well for Dynasty. So once again, if you like what you've seen and heard, feel free to like and subscribe. Thanks.